Bon dia, guten Morgen a tothom. Gràcies per haver vingut. Aquest seminari d'avui el dedicarem a les reformes, a les conseqüències i als impactes de les reformes del federalisme alemany. El 2006, després d'anys de debats i infructuosos intents, es va aconseguir el suficient consens polític per tirar endavant una doble reforma del sistema federal alemany. La primera estava adreçada a solucionar dos punts negres del sistema competencial. Per una banda, la Joint Decision Trap, o la trampa de la presa de decisions conjunta, i l'esclariment de les competències entre el govern federal i els Länders. Una pota seria la nostra visió d'aquest esclariment competencial, la nostra visió de garantir l'exclusivitat de les competències exclusives, en sona. La segona part de la reforma, que va ser en un segon moment, no van anar juntes, estava adreçada a les relacions fiscals entre el govern federal i els Länder. Avui parlarem, doncs, de quin impacte han tingut aquestes reformes sobre el federalisme alemany, sobre les tendències, sigui a la descentralització del sistema o a la centralització, i l'impacte en concret de les solucions que buscaven en la seva definició. Per parlar d'això tenim a dues persones aquí al meu costat. Dominic Haynes, investigador postdoctoral a l'IEP de Lyon, Lyon, treballa sobre Multilevel Governance and Trust. El seu tutor de tesi va ser el professor alemany expert en federalisme, Arthur Benz, i entre d'altres treballs ha publicat a la revista German Politics i també a la Regional and Federal Studies. A l'esquerra tinc a Iris Royce, és una investigadora que està a punt d'acabar la seva tesi doctoral a la Universitat de Bamberg, però que ja té una llarga llista de publicacions. La seva tesi, a més, esperem felicitar-la d'aquí un mes perquè l'entregarà. Ha publicat a la revista German Politics i ha participat en un llibre conjunt, oi? Que ho sento, no he apuntat el títol. Comencem, doncs, em penso que comença Dominic i després continuarà Iris. Dominic se centrarà sobre el tema de la reforma en temes fiscals i Iris en el tema de les competències.
Yes, first of all, the separation we agreed upon is that I want to say shortly thank you for the invitation, thank you to the Institute. And apart from the gratitude I want to express, and the planned separation is that Iris will start with the first federal reform, then I will continue with the second federal reform, and she will finish up the presentation and hopefully open the floor to your questions. Therefore, Iris, go ahead.
Thank you. Okay, how can I start with this? Sorry. Now it works. Okay. Yeah. Thanks. Okay, my topic today is if Germany is after the reform on a successful road to more federalism, so that means what is the impact of the reform on the German Länder. And first of all, in brief, some introductory words. As you might know, the German state, it was said that it has a unitary political culture, that there's only little support of citizens for diversity, strong public demands for equal living conditions. So we can see a long trend of coordination and harmonization, and by Hesse it was called the unitary federal state, therefore. However, at least since unification in 1990, we can also see a contrary trend, increasing socioeconomic, cultural, and political differences, and those resulting in different policies. However, there were huge problems, the high degree of interdependence between the two levels of government, and so in 2006 we had the Federalism Reform 1. And the aim was to give more autonomous scope for both levels of government. And so 18 legislative powers were transferred into the exclusive responsibility of the Länder. So the questions to be addressed in my PhD are, first, to what extent did the Länder benefit from the reform? So in how far is their new scope? Then second, did the reform actually result in more federalism? First, the content of laws, is there more diversity or again uniformity? And then second, the process of legislation, can we see more independence, or is there again coordination and harmonization? And then of course, if it is this or this, which factors can explain the legislative decisions of the Länder? These are the new legislative powers. On the left side, and on the right side, the legislative activity on the Länder, the number of Länder who have passed one or more laws. And you can see that it is divided. A bit more than half of the new legislative powers were widely used, but there are others where not a single land has done something. And so, of course, the question is why. And that leads us to the scope question. There are certain limitations. Due to time, I cannot go into detail so much, but for example, lots of competences were transferred to the Länder that are limited by court decisions. For example, the penitentiary system, there are numerous court decisions concerning the right of the prisoners, for example, religion or communication or space and so on. Then there are other competences that seem to give a lot new space to the Länder, but it's restricted by overlap of several federal competences. For example, in the care homes, the law of contract is still federal law. So there is a part for the Länder, but there is still substantial scope that remained at the federal level. And then there are also some new powers that offer scope, but no new scope. You can see it at the bottom of the table. For example, the press law, there has never been a federal press law, so it's no new scope. The Länder have always been able to pass their own laws. So, in this table, I have marked green, where we can find substantial new scope, and gray, where this is not the case. And so the conclusion is, although there's, by first sight, a large number of new legislative powers, the new scope connected with them is actually smaller due to numerous limitations. So in my PhD for in-depth analysis, I have selected 4 policies which offer substantial new scope, because individual legislation is only possible if there is enough new scope. And my analysis includes all legislative processes in all 16 Länder between 2006 and 16, and the method is, first of all, comparison of laws, and then process tracing based on parliamentary documents, newspaper content analysis, and interviews. So the 4 competences I have selected are the shop closing time, amusement arcades, the penitentiary system, and care homes. To compare the laws, and to just say something about the degree of diversity, I have first of all developed a policy index for all of those competences. The index grasps all essential aspects of the policy, and the scores reflect the different regulations in the laws. It's an additive index. That means the single scores are summed up to a total score. And you can see 3 examples here concerning the penitentiary system. For example, component B is the principles of execution that are stated in the law. That means how many rights are given to the prisoners. And rights are, for example, to respect the individual personality or religion, age, and so on. So finally, it looks like this, and of course, it doesn't say so much for the first sight. That is the single scores and the 24 index components, but we can see more when we look at the total scores. This is a ranking of all laws, and we can see that on the left side, the lower scores, there's a more restrictive law, that means less rights for the prisoners, and on the right side is the less restrictive laws, the higher score. So if we compare the total scores according to the indices, we can see some interesting points. For example, if you compare the shop closing time in the left above, the dark blue column, the dark blue box, is the federal law. And we can see that all new Länder laws are less restrictive than the federal law, so more opening time for shops. And in contrast, for care homes, we can see the left is the federal law, so it was not much restrictive, and we can see more restrictive laws, more duties for the person who own the care homes in the Länder laws. Then it's also interesting to see how many agreements are there. Are there groups of Länder who have the same regulations? And we can see for shop closing time that the biggest group of Länder with agreements is those 6 Länder, and they have in 4 index components agreements. If we count also the components where only 1 land deviated, then it's 5. For care homes, it's 5 Länder and 4 or 6 index components. And then more for amusement arcades, here we can see 7 Länder, and in 6 index components, all 7 Länder did the same regulations. And in 12 index components, they have the same, only 1 of the Länder deviated. Then we can see a lot of agreements concerning the penitentiary system. As I said, there is 2 groups. The first group is the more restrictive laws. 5 Länder have very similar regulations. And then we have another group, the less restrictive laws, group 2. They have developed a sample draft bill. And you can see that there are agreements in 10 or 14 index components. So this nice colored graph shows us the degree of differentiation as a whole. I have tried to, I have thought about the question how I can make visible if there's much differentiation and if there's concentration somehow. And in this case, each column is 1 index component, and the amount of different colors tells us how many different regulations there are in all the laws. So if there are in 1 column lots of different colors, that means we can find lots of different regulations in the laws. If there are only 2 colors, then we can see that some of the Länder decided for A and some for B, but there are no other regulations. And so we can see that there's a lot of diversity concerning the shop closing time and concerning the care homes, lots of different colors, and there's not so much concentration. And in contrast, concerning the penitentiary system and amusement arcades, we can see not so many colors, so there's not so much differentiation, and there's a lot of concentration. That means, for example, 14 of the 16 Länder, all of them did the same, and only 2 deviated. So the conclusion is, first of all, that yes, there is such a reflex of coordination. Lots of politicians talked about the need of at least some uniformity despite of the reform. But we can also see that the contents of laws finally show much more diversity than you would expect when you listen to the politicians talking about it. So such claims have often been rhetoric. You can see it here on the right side concerning the penitentiary system. They have developed a sample draft bill, and nevertheless, there are lots of deviations. In 10 components of the index, it's the same in all Länder that are involved in the group, but it's between 3 and 8 deviations per country. So that means in 3 to 8 aspects, this state decided to go its own way. So then the second part of the conclusion is that there is a connection between coordination and harmonization. We can see more agreements of regulations when coordination took place. There are 2 with coordination, the penitentiary system. There has been a sample draft bill, and concerning amusement arcades, there was a state contract concerning some issues, not all issues. However, also here we can see coordination does not determine the result. often there is still a distinctive own shape of the law. So, as we can see, as I said, there is no clear connection between the process of legislation and the results of legislation. It is important to go beyond the mere comparison of laws for analysis and to take into account the process of legislation, so more information. Because independent legislation, what was the aim of the Federalism Reform, can occur in two forms. The first is that the content of the law deviates from the others. So that would mean individual solutions somehow. But it can also be that they have the same result, the same regulations in law, but they have passed their law in an independent process, without coordination, without the intent of harmonization. I have marked it here in an example of my index. The red arrows show that there are agreements between two Länder, and the question is now, do they have the same regulations because they wanted to have them or just by accident? So I have developed a theory model, and I fear there's not enough time to go through it in detail, but it's written from the perspective of a single land. It's the decision you have to take within the legislative process, and I said there are three factors that influence that should facilitate assimilation and harmonization. It's first of all normative reasons. If the politicians are convinced that equal living conditions are important despite the reform. Then the second is emulation and learning. If you want to take over a regulation of another land because you think it's a good regulation. And the third is competition, that you fear disadvantages if you don't take over a certain regulation. And then on the other hand, I expect independent legislation. This is the green factors, when some factors are important that are also important without the federal context: socioeconomic situation, citizens, their positions and demands, interest groups, and party ideology. And there's also a middle way, that there's some assimilation but modified by some factors within the state. So I cannot go through all the details, unfortunately, but a short conclusion concerning the approach. It's really interesting to take into account the information about the legislative process than only the mere comparison of laws. That offers interesting insights. And we can see in many cases in which we observe similar regulations in the laws that these have not been the result of intentional harmonization. So there is a higher degree of independence regarding the Länder legislation than one would assume only with regard to the content of laws. You can see that very well when you look at the legislation of the penitentiary system. As I said, here group 2, the less restrictive laws. There's much overlap, lots of agreements between the laws, and these Länder established a group of coordination. So they wanted to harmonize. But the second group, the more restrictive laws, these 5 Länder passed very similar laws, but they had nothing to do with each other. That were completely independent legislative processes, and the agreements are by accident, due to the partisan composition of government. All of these Länder were governed by Christian democratic parties, and they wanted to have strict rules. They said security is the most important thing, and so less rights and more duties for the prisoners. Then the conclusion concerning the theory. First, assimilation. As I said, the normative reasons that there should be equal living conditions all across Germany were often mentioned by politicians, but finally, at least in these 4 cases, not leading to large agreement of regulations. Competition was, in some cases, especially the economic policies, a big issue, and it was largely discussed by neighboring states, but finally, only certain aspects of laws were influenced. And emulation and learning, at least in the way of diffusion research, was less important in these cases. Then concerning the independence, it was also interesting for me if this question we always ask, do parties matter? And yes, they do matter. Party ideology is still the most important factor shaping the laws, and we can see remarkably different positions of the regional associations. So, for example, the Social Democrats in Baden-Württemberg is far away from the Social Democrats in Berlin. Then the socio-economic situation was also important, though not in terms of regional peculiarities. There were only some cases where regional peculiarities became important. It was rather in terms of general developments of society. So a similar pressure in the Länder. There was no clear tendency concerning the influence of interest groups, and they have been most successful when competition mattered. They intensified the pressure of competition between Länder. And the citizens or certain groups were sometimes mentioned, but surprisingly little references have been to the voters and as well to the media. That was a surprise for me, because in my diploma thesis, I had a very different case, where the media had a lot of influence. So then my conclusion on the whole, the impact of the reform. First, the aim was a revival of Länder politics. And here a clear yes, that worked. Most of the legislative processes were marked by intensive parliamentary debates. Obviously, the representatives had become more aware of their position and say they felt strengthened to legislate. And then the second aim, more federalism, also yes. And 3 out of 4 selected powers, we can observe a high degree of independent legislation as well as significantly differing laws. And so the observations do definitely not comply with the thesis of Germany as the hidden centralized state. So there is, I don't know, I cannot say, as I have no before and after comparison, if it's new federalism, but there is substantial federalism. However, this counts first of all for the legislative powers I have analyzed. With regard to several other powers, the development was different, and that is often due to limited scope connected with the new powers. That is what I said at the beginning. The impact of the reform is smaller because the amount of new scope is smaller than necessary for real new federalism. But I can say if the Länder got new scope, most of them used it. So I would say that there is still hope for Germany for more federalism in the future, but we need another reform.
Gràcies. Passem a la segona ponència.
Thank you very much. Yes, thank you very much for your presentation about the first federal reform years, and again for the invitation. But my point is that the federalism reform too, obviously, and we cannot consider the first federal reform without the second federal reform. Therefore, I will say some words about the agenda setting of the second federal reform, of the circumstances that led to the second federal reform. And there I take the points that Iris made. Then I will lose some words about the negotiations, about the results and the proceedings of the second federal reform. And I will conclude with some remarks about the entire reform process. As I already mentioned a bit, that the reason why there was a second federal reform is, surprise, surprise, there was a first federal reform. And in order to implement this reform, as it might be known, qualified majorities are needed in Bundestag and Bundesrat, but at the time, the federal government had only 44 votes in Bundesrat, and the qualified majority is unfortunately at 46 votes. So they had not enough votes in the second chamber, hence they could not accomplish their first federal reform. At the same time, it was an important reason, it was an important point for them, because at the time, Social Democrats and Christian Democrats formed as we call it in Germany, a grand coalition, but they proved to be election losers as compared to 2002. So the election losers form nevertheless a government, so they need a great project for justifying their government, and this great project was the first federal reform Iris spoke about, and participants like Edmund Stoiber, like the head of the Bavarian state, says it's the mother of all reforms. So it was supposed to be a great project, but unfortunately for implementing this great project, majorities were simply not there in Bundesrat. Hence, they needed something to convince Bundesrat for agreeing to this first federal reform, and this was the second federal reform. So the reason for the second federal reform is the first federal reform, and there is it's not good, according to me, of course, only to speak about the first federal reform. In reality, you have to take both reforms to have a full picture of German federalism. Yeah, and the content of this second federal reform were, of course, the aspects that have been excluded before, which were all the finances and taxes of what is called fiscal federalism so far. And they were excluded in the first federal reform because of good reasons, because there was too much not enough content, to phrase it like that, for having a compromise at all. So far, because of that, they excluded any aspect of fiscal federalism, and this second reform should take up these points again and form a compromise about fiscal federalism. That was the goal. But then a ruling of the Federal Constitutional Court, the FCC, changed the agenda a little bit. It narrowed down the agenda from fiscal federalism to avoiding budget crisis. So no more taxes, no more direct payments, no fiscal equalization, only avoiding budget crisis. And indeed, that's what the second federal reform had as a result, was a mechanism to detect in beforehand budget crisis and at best to avoid budget crisis, besides some other minor aspects. And it's not an unimportant thing, avoiding budget crisis, as this graph shows. It shows the state debt on the one hand, and on the other hand the time, and we really see that there is a problem regarding state debts, because we see from the beginning on an ever-rising debt mountain. So it was not, the FCC did not touch upon an unimportant thing. It was in reality, it was an important thing, and particularly in 2007, before the financial and economic crisis, it was really a need for a political mechanism of detecting budget crisis and for avoiding budget crisis at best. And here in the graph, we see, of course, at the beginning of the history of the Federal Republic, nearly no state debt, and then a slow rise of state debt because of the oil price shock in the 70s, and then levels of state debt diverged after German reunification in 1990. And there we see that federal state debt in the straight line at the top of the graph rises, and the Länder state debt in total as the punctuated line in the second. There is a gap between those two, but nevertheless both rise. I did not present the state debt of the municipalities, but they show the same direction. So the overall level of state debt was a problem for the FCC, but there was another problem, and this was related to the ideology so far, which was coined by Keynes, which is in a nutshell taking up state debt in hard times and spending money in good times, so that there can be economic growth again, and everything is fine. But regarding the mountain of state debts, we see that the German governments in Bund and Länder took up state debts in bad times, as foreseen, but they also took up state debts in good times. So they did not pay back state debts in total. So it did not work out, the idea of Keynes. And therefore, a change was needed in budget policy, and this change took place in the second federal reform. And now the new paradigm of balanced budgets should diminish the amount of state debts. And there we see later on some criticism in the literature. Anyhow, this was the idea of the second federal reform. But when those things were negotiated in the second Federal Reform Commission, the financial and economic crisis hit Germany. The Commission started in 2007, and 2008 and 2009 the financial and economic crisis occurred. So German politics in Bund and Länder had to deal with the crisis and the consequences of the crisis. And the heads of government at the time, on the federal level and Bund level and the Länder level, they were pretty critical against state debts. So they were all to reduce state debts. But at the same time, they were in trouble. They were in a dilemma, because on the one hand, they wanted to reduce state debts, but because of the crisis, they had to launch stimulus packages that increased state debts anew. So also, if it did not belong to their party political preferences, they were forced to launch those stimulus packages in order to overcome the crisis or the results of the crisis. And at this point, the second federal reform was a way out of this dilemma, because they confessed that maybe their goal, their party political goal, their ideology did not play out at the time, but later on. So that was justification for the reasons of the debt breaks they introduced in the basic law at the time. So it was a way out of the paradox situation that the heaviest critics of state debts caused the highest rise of state debts at the time. It was not left governments or the left side of the party political spectrum. And here we have the positions in the Commission towards budget crisis that right political parties favor balanced budgets, favored balanced budgets. They rejected rising state debt indebtedness, so they imported debt breaks. And the political left, on the other side, was reluctant to balance budgets as the new budget paradigm, and they accepted a rising state indebtedness, and they saw no reasons for debt breaks at all. Hence, the negotiations in the Federal Reform Commission was about to be ended, not successfully, but nevertheless, the Commission presented its results. Yeah, and the results were that the budgets of Bund and Länder in general had to be put up without state debts. And for the Bund, for the federal level, this should be accomplished until 2016, and for Länder, this should be accomplished until 2020. Of course, there are some exceptions. The one exception is that state debts are indeed allowed to a little bit if in total the entire German state, so the federal level and the Länder level, do not have a higher state indebtedness than 0.5% of the GDP. And of this 0.5% of GDP, it's split up among federal level and Länder level. And for the federal level, it's 0.15%, and for Länder, it's 0.35%, so about nothing. But that's already very hard. The second exception of this rule of balanced budgets is that if the economy is not performing in a normal way, then state debts are allowed. Now one might ask, where do we know if the economy is performing in a normal way or not? I don't know. It's a political decision. There are entire libraries for economics that try to explain me when the economy is in a normal position and when the economy is in an exceptional position. I'm not an economist. I cannot comment on that. I can only say this is one exception of the general rule of having budgets without any state debts. And the third exception is natural disasters and crisis is not influenceable by the state, then state debts are allowed as well. This should correct the one consequence of the first federal reform, where it was not allowed for the federal government to invest in municipalities or Länder. That brought about the paradox situation that the federal government was more allowed to build up a school in Banda Aceh, for example, in Thailand, but not in the Saarland, for example. And therefore, this exception was taken up in the second federal reform. Beside that, this target of having balanced budgets to a certain point in time, beside that, a new institution was established, the so-called Stability Council, where budgets of Bund and Länder are monitored and budget crises should be detected in beforehand and avoided. And of course, of course, I don't know, and also there several financial assistance for the 5 weakest Länder was agreed upon. And if you take the 5 weakest Länder and the Grand Coalition with conservatives and liberals, then the majority was given for the second federal reform. So the results I just presented became law, and we can sum up that the reason for the second federal reform is not surprisingly the first federal reform. Hence, just regarding one would be one-sided, at least to me. And whereas the first federal reform, we just heard about it, decentralized policies and competences, we can say that in the second federal reform, Bund and Länder missed a chance to do so. And instead of decentralizing fiscal competences, they established a new body, a new mechanism of budget control, of budget monitoring, and this is not decentralization. This is maybe a new form of joint decision making, and that's about my subject I'm dealing with. Hence, we see in this example a feature typically for German federalism, that the agenda is mainly determined by the FCC, by the Federal Constitutional Court, and Bundesrat and Bundestag deal with it. But at the same time, we don't know if the concept that I just presented will work in the future. There is heavy critique from academia towards the way Bund and Länder deal with state debt. For example, scholars argue that both rules, the rule of having balanced budgets to a certain point in time and avoiding budget crisis in the Stability Council, they contradict each other. That Mr. Corriot he is doing that in the same special issue than your paper. And of course, another article argues that this way of avoiding budget crisis avoids new investments in German infrastructure and in municipalities. I do not want to oppress this critique of academia. Nevertheless, I think despite that critique, it is working very well. Maybe not because of the institutional rules, maybe more about because of the good economic performance. Nevertheless, the timing and the naming and shaming of bad budget policy works quite well, so that state debts of Germany go down again, and this will be successful in the long run. That's at least my point of view. Of course, colleagues have other opinions. I have to accept that. Nevertheless, that was my point. Thank you for your attention for this presentation.